As Jared mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit today about just kind of a quick start for evaluating and testing web accessibility. I'm John Whiting, Director of Training here at WebAIM. I've been here with Jared for quite a few years and had a chance to do a lot of evaluation over the years, and we're just going to share some of the tips and techniques that we find helpful. There is a detailed evaluation guide available at webaim.org/articles/evaluation guide. I'll throw that into chat if someone doesn't beat me to it. Someone probably will. And sorry about that. Let me throw that into chat. Basically, everything we're going to talk about will, the details, the how-to, additional articles and resources. You can find all of that in this guide. I mean, we invite you to really maybe just enjoy or hopefully enjoy some of the principles we're going to talk about and be confident that when you want to go back to some of the how-to, they'll be able to find it there.
So as we talk about accessibility testing and evaluation, there really is a bit of a process and some steps to this. And really, even these aspects of accessibility testing are within a much broader context of an accessibility effort. And so we have limited time. We're going to focus on just some smaller components of this. But first, we need to decide what it is that we're testing, right? What is the scope? What are the accessibility standards and guidelines that we might be shooting for? And then after we define that overall very high level scope, then we can kind of get down a little more narrow to the sample that we're going to test. What sites, what pages, what are we going to prioritize? And that very often is influenced by priorities in which things are going to be remediated first. You want to test the things that are going to be probably the most impactful on your users and address those impactful accessibility issues first. And then comes the actual accessibility testing and evaluation. And that's what we're going to really focus on. And then after that, there's going to be a documentation and reporting component to this. And, with that is going to kind of more traditional QA and remediation processes, but that needs some documentation. What we're really going to focus on today is the evaluation component of this. We have 45 minutes. And so we're going to really drill down into some detail in this evaluation and testing component. And even within this evaluation piece, there are maybe some subcomponents that we might consider. One would be really site-wide or sample-wide accessibility testing. Tools like PopeTech are really, really helpful with that, right? They can find site-wide issues. They can give you a sense of the overall accessibility of an entire site or an entire web property. They can identify problem areas within that site. They can help get the problems to the right people so that they can start to be remediated, and so much more. Those tools can be helpful to drill down to more individual pages and components and individual issues, but having that high-level view, that site-wide view is really, really helpful. And below there is maybe a little bit less of a site-wide, but it's still a pretty high-level examination of accessibility. That's looking at site areas, maybe various templates that are in use on a website, maybe even at the component level, shared components that might be used throughout a site. That's really where we're starting to get a little more into like trends and patterns of accessibility, aligning those with various site areas and teams within an organization. And then there's real in-depth or page level or code level accessibility testing. And that's really where we're going to focus, right? Is kind of that in-depth page level, code level evaluation and testing today. And so this may seem like a really small component, right, of an overall evaluation and testing effort within an organization. But I would argue that it's perhaps the most important component of testing, because this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where end users are going to interact with things that are going to pose accessibility barriers to them. So we just wanted to provide a little bit of context for where we're at. We know there's so much more for accessibility testing and efforts, but we're going to really focus down at getting into the detail of accessibility evaluation and testing at that level. Now, We know there are probably some here that are not like coders or developers. That's okay. We're going to try to talk about some principles of accessibility testing and evaluation, and then get into the tools and details that come along with that. So we hope it'll be helpful for a wide variety of roles and audience that might be out there.
Most of us are probably familiar with the 5 or maybe 6 really W's of journalism or of investigation. And you know, this is really also the case when it comes to evaluation of accessibility. You know, as part of this evaluation process, when you discover an issue, kind of drill into that issue and think, well, who does this impact? And you know, what is the problem? Really, what is the accessibility issue that's occurring? And sometimes even when does it occur? Maybe it only happens when you interact with the page in a certain way. And then, you know, it becomes this important place of, well, where does it occur? And I really think that kind of happens at 2 levels as you're evaluating and trying to drill in. One is, you know, where in the page. Another, though, is where in the code or the HTML of that page. And then as you continue to kind of drill down and investigate this more, you start to come to these questions of, well, why did this happen? What went wrong? What isn't, you know, what should be working one way but isn't? And then, you know, that hopefully the question that you can answer is, how do you fix it? You know, so now that we know something's broken, well, okay, what do I do about it so that this thing can be more accessible to people who might have difficulty accessing it? Now, that's a lot of things to keep track of. I will say, you know, we're not going to focus on reporting, but I think often effective reporting is this. It's answering these questions over and over and over again as you identify new issues. And the extent that you can be pretty clear in answering these questions, you know, I think that's going to be useful information for if maybe someone else is going to review and do these repairs. If we want to maybe try to approach this, though, at an easier level or at maybe fewer things to think about, you can kind of lump these issues into 2, I think, big categories. And so I've got in this page these same 5 issues visually broken up into 2 groups. One is discover and the other is inspect. So those questions of who, what, when, and probably even where in the page, those questions are questions that you can answer as you discover issues. So you're looking at a page at this high level and you come in and you see something. Well, this thing needs to be addressed. You know, who, what, when, where in the page does this occur? And then there is a kind of a deeper drilling down or diving into a specific issue. We're going to call that inspect. So where does that happen in the code? I don't know about you, but I know sometimes in reports that I've done or in reports that I've read, I thought, oh, I really know where you know, as I'm writing something, I think, oh, it's really, really clear what's going on and where it is. But, you know, often for the person who's going to be fixing that, where is that in the code? Can you show me the HTML, you know, where that's going to occur so that I can make sure I know exactly where I need to fix this? The why did it happen? That often requires, I mean, really maybe a deeper look into what's happening under the hood, and often, especially that how do you fix it? Now, I think with this process, there is going to be maybe a requirement of, I think a good way to say this, some of these things might require more familiarity with HTML and maybe with CSS or JavaScript or some of these languages or just techniques. You can do a lot of discovery without really digging into code. And if that's where you're comfortable, we're going to talk about that a lot. If, however, you're a little more comfortable digging in a little bit and inspecting, it's really hard, I think impossible maybe, to create a one-size-fits-all training on evaluation, because you're going to have some people saying, wait, slow down. And you're going to have other people saying, let's just cut to the chase and dive into the code. So we're going to try to, you know, maybe talk about this at these 2 levels of how do you discover issues and then how do you dig deeper into these issues and inspect them. So examples of some discovery type tools. And so we've got this visually in 2 categories. One has kind of a binocular visual representation of this, and that's tools, discovery tools like a screen reader, a keyboard interaction, mouse interaction, or like even a visual scan sometimes of a page to identify potential issues. So those are some really important tools to discover. And then to inspect or to go deeper, you're going to have tools like browser inspection tools. We will talk about, and we will use the term dev tools quite a bit in the next little bit. And that's a developer, it's a tool built into a browser to inspect or dig deeper into your code. Now, you don't have to understand everything there is to know about HTML to use these tools. We provided trainings on using developer tools, even if you're not a developer. But that is kind of what the tool's for. We're going to focus on Chrome Dev Tools. It's built into the Chrome browser. There are other purpose-built tools. Contrast checkers may be an example of this, where it's really the purpose of this is to inspect something that you've identified using some other tool. So the one thing that has become more and more clear to me as I've tried to do my own evaluation, and hopefully as part of our work here at WebAIM, create resources to help other people in evaluation. One thing that's become clear to me is that effective testing requires a constant, a regular switching between discovery and investigation. You find an issue, you dig into that issue. And so what that means is you're going to have to jump pretty frequently between tools that are good for discovery and tools that are good for inspection. And so part of, I think, effective evaluation is that jumping back and forth. So an example of that might be something like, I find something with the screen reader. So that helped me identify an issue. To know really the why and the how to fix it, I'm going to use browser developer tools or dev tools to dig a little deeper. Or with a visual scan, identified something where I think there might be a contrast issue. I'm going to find some colors and do some testing using a contrast checker to determine, well, how significant is this issue? Does it fail requirements in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines? Those kinds of things.
There was a question in chat. I was wondering if we could add another how at the bottom of our list. Like, how do you fix it? Do you fix immediate issues, or versus how do we stop it happening again, versus fix the process for the future? Yeah, absolutely. As we were putting this together, we came up with a whole lot more W's, right, that we could add on there. And just for sake of time, we're going to focus on these. But really, I think the intent of our narrow focus today is to inform those broader questions, right? Okay, so here are accessibility issues. We need to document how to fix them, and hopefully beyond just fixing that one instance, how do we fix this site-wide? And even more important, how do we fix this from happening again in the future? So yeah, it's really important, but that's going to be a little bit beyond the scope of what we're going to cover today. It's a great question, though. So one important aspect of this that John talked about briefly is screen reader testing. And this is one of the most important discovery tools that's out there, because users with visual disabilities can very often be most impacted by accessibility issues, and using a screen reader is going to best reveal the actual user issues for those screen reader users, because they are you're using that tool that the end user is going to be using. So we suggest a few tips or thoughts about screen reader testing. One is, don't try to be an expert. The reality is most screen reader users are not experts in their own assistive technology. So, if you come to a level of expertise in a screen reader where you can work around issues, you probably are going to have difficulty identifying those issues. Yeah, usually about 10 keyboard shortcuts is really all you need to get started. 20 is all you need to do some pretty in-depth screen reader testing. No, the screen readers do behave differently. They can misbehave. They can be buggy. Just keep that in mind. We usually recommend keeping the default settings in your screen reader. Don't do too much customization. Screen reader users this is a bit of a generalization, but tend to not do a lot of customization, and just testing with those defaults for the most part is going to give you a fairly typical experience. Do focus on document structure, navigation, forms, dynamic content. We're going to get into some of those as we go. When it comes to the screen readers that you might use, On the desktop side for Windows, there's the JAWS screen reader survey data that we have from screen reader users. Our last survey indicated that 54% of respondents, JAWS was the primary desktop or laptop screen reader. Does come with a price tag for sure, but it is, as of our last survey, the most commonly used screen reader. NVDA is free and open source. Was used by 31% of our survey respondents. VoiceOver on Mac, about 7%. That is an important note. Very often we see some disparities between what is often used in accessibility testing, very often VoiceOver, and what is most commonly used out there, by far JAWS and NVDA. On the mobile side, our data indicate that VoiceOver for iOS is by far the most common mobile screen reader. 72% of respondents to our survey, screen reader users to our survey use VoiceOver on iOS, and 25% TalkBack on Android. And there are others that are out there. ChromeVox is one for Chromebooks, or an extension for the Chrome browser. Not usually recommended much for testing because it's rarely used by people with disabilities. Narrator for Windows is becoming much more full-featured and maybe starting to be recommended, but it's not used all that commonly yet as a primary screen reader by those with disabilities. Of course, we can also layer on top of this browsers, and it starts to get really complex. You could build this huge, really complex matrix of browsers and screen readers, but primarily focusing with JAWS or NVDA on Windows, VoiceOver on Mac, and then doing some mobile testing on common browsers. Almost always is going to identify the vast majority of accessibility issues. There's a question there from Mark. Do you have a list of the 20 screen reader shortcuts? Well, we have articles on the WebAIM site for all of these major screen readers that will get you started. It will show you the primary screen reader shortcuts and how to use it, primarily focused on evaluation and testing, with some example files that you can use to help get up to speed. So I'd refer you to the webaim.org site to learn a little bit more about that.
And I did just put a link in chat, and I actually just linked back to that evaluation guide again, but that does contain links to these kind of tutorials and practice areas that Jared talked about.
Yeah, there was one quick question I'll address. A question: what is the percentage used by screen reader users, not just testers? In our screen reader survey results, we find there usually is not very much difference between those that use a screen reader based on a disability versus those that use it for testing. Where there are discrepancies in responses to our survey, we do highlight those in our survey results article. So you can refer to that to get a better sense as to what some of those disparities might be. So great question.
And I did also just put a link in the chat for that as well, for the most recent of those surveys of screen reader users, if you do want to dig a little deeper on those questions. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about, Jared just talked about screen readers as an example, and we're going to dig deeper into some of these specific types of discovery and inspection tools. We do want to mention, though, there are some tools that are also purpose-built for hopefully to maybe help do a little bit of both. Now, I do think the ones on the far ends, things like a screen reader or a keyboard interaction or mouse interaction, things we're going to talk about, that is the user experience, as Jared said. So it's always going to be, in some ways, the most true way to identify those issues. And tools like DevTools, that's the code where it's happening, and that's kind of the final word on what's actually being presented to the end user. But there are tools that are built specifically for accessibility evaluation. There are a lot of them. There are a lot of very good, capable tools. We are WebAIM. We're going to talk about Wave. Wave as a WebAIM evaluation tool that we're going to talk about a little bit and demonstrate and use in some of our activities. One thing though that we do think WebAIM is maybe not the only tool, but is really, really designed with in mind is to help with this process, not just to identify issues in code, but to really encourage the identification and further investigation or inspection of potential accessibility issues. So with that, we're going to do a little, Jared's going to talk a little bit about some of this, some WebAIM, some of the ways that you can use the Wave tool to evaluate content. For this example, Again, mostly probably just feel free to watch and follow along, but I'm going to throw in a chat a page that we are going to look at. This is an example of a page from NASA. I'll pull this over in my screen share as well. So Jared is just going to talk through a little bit of how you can use WAVE as an evaluation tool.
Yeah. We know that many of you are probably already familiar with WAVE, so we're not going to get into a lot of detail, but really focus on how WAVE can fit in that middle component of testing and can help facilitate manual testing that extends beyond the limitations of automated testing tools. So we have an online version of WAVE available at wave.webaim.org. That can test web content if it's publicly available. Because it's a web app, there are some limitations to that tool. In fact, there was a comment in chat, maybe I'll just answer that now. It was any tips for testing or documenting in React or other dynamic front-end systems, that can be really complex. Sometimes they don't work very well in WAVE. There are some limitations with the online WAVE service, just because that content kind of needs to funnel via our servers. And so really, really complex script-driven applications sometimes may be limited. That's something we're trying to expand and provide more support, but it's kind of an inherent limitation of the online web version of WAVE. So what you can do, but the online version is great, right? For testing, you just put in a website address. It's fun. It's going to provide you feedback about accessibility. What we typically recommend if you're doing more than just a little bit of testing is to use the WAVE browser extensions. We have extensions for Chrome, Firefox, and Edge browsers. They're freely available. You can download those. That's what John's going to be using. He'll go to this page and activate the WAVE extension. And what WAVE will do is it will inject into the page icons and indicators to give feedback about accessibility, and then present a sidebar that allows you to really start to dig deeper into the accessibility of that particular page. The sidebar shows a high-level summary of accessibility. On this page, it found 3 detectable accessibility errors and 8 contrast errors. Now, errors are going to be things that we know impact users, that are going to align with failures or non-compliance with the web content accessibility guidelines with a high level of reliability. There's a question in Q&A, what percentage of WCAG 2.1 does the WAVE tool cover? That's really hard to answer because just as far as pure automated tests, I can do an awful lot. I don't even know a percentage, like a percentage of success criteria or techniques, or it's really hard to quantify that, but it does an awful lot. The things that it can detect, those errors are going to be among the things that are most impactful for users with disabilities. But what WAVE really tries to help you do is to get deeper into that conformance testing. And where you can start to do that is in the details panel. It's going to provide additional information about the things that WAVE has detected. So things like accessibility alerts. Alerts is really kind of that middle ground, right? This is something that WAVE has detected that says, hey, there's something here that seems to be an accessibility issue or is a likely issue, but we can't know for sure. It's something that's going to necessitate some additional examination by a human, somebody with some gray matter that can actually assess the potential accessibility impact, and then maybe the potential compliance or conformance with accessibility guidelines. For instance, this is there's an orange icon here for an alert that's indicating there's long alternative text. Wouldn't always be an accessibility failure or even an accessibility issue, but very often if alternative text is exceptionally long, that may not be appropriate for that image. So WAVE has just identified that as something to prompt the WAVE user to take a closer look. That's that examination piece, right? It's discovery and examination, right? WAVE bridging that gap of it saying, hey, here's something you need to look at. Now let's actually look at it in a lot more depth. Even accessibility features in WAVE, even while that seems to be a pattern that supports accessibility, it's still important that you go in and do some additional testing and look at it in more depth. So There's additional details in here. You can click on an icon and go to a reference or to the reference panel in the sidebar to get documentation about what these things are telling you, what it means, how it impacts users with disabilities, how to fix it, the algorithm that Wave used to identify that, and then relevant web content accessibility guidelines for that particular thing. And there are some additional tools in here that we'll show along the way. One I want to highlight real quickly is the code panel at the bottom. You can expand and get a lot more detail, actually seeing the underlying code or the DOM of the page. Again, when you get to that real examination, right, getting into the detail, Wave can help facilitate that by letting you get into the actual code so you can see what is it in the page that was causing this particular accessibility issue to be present. In this particular case, it's a misalignment between a form label and an input, and Wave has identified that. Seeing it in the code allows you to kind of see it in a little more detail why that particular error has been identified. One quick question, I'll take this one. How accessible is Wave with screen readers or keyboard only users? We have tried to make it very accessible to end users with disabilities. We get a lot of good feedback about it as being an accessible tool. We're always open to feedback to make it better, just with a disclaimer that Wave can't fix accessibility issues, right? So if there are inherent accessibility issues in the page, they will still be present when Wave has done that testing. So that can pose some barriers to using Wave for testing, because it can't magically fix those things. A good question.
Okay, so let's continue and go through this process of identifying and then just kind of digging deeper into some issues. We'll talk about some tools that might be effective for some of these.
So we want to talk quickly about regions and headings. So regions being a significant page area that can be defined in the code of the page. So you can identify the header, the main content, the footer area, sidebars, search areas, navigation, and so forth. Really helpful for accessibility. You can also identify headings in the page, the main first level heading that describes the content of the page, subheadings that describe sections of content, and then subsections and so forth. That heading structure is really important to accessibility. And you could use a screen reader to do that. In JAWS, you can hit the R key, NVDA, the D key to navigate by regions or landmarks and see what the content is within those regions or landmarks. You can hit the H key to navigate by headings within the page. That can give you a good sense of the region and heading structure of the page. In VoiceOver, you can use the rotor to see the regions, to see the headings, and see how they align with the visual presentation of that content. So screen reader is a great way to kind of explore and identify what potential issues might be with regions and headings. On the other extreme, you could use dev tools, right, to actually look at the code, especially if you find an issue in the screen reader. You could then go into the code to see why that particular issue is present. But in this case, Wave provides a real easy and excellent tool that bridges that gap between the user experience and the code, and that's in the Wave Structure tab, and John will demonstrate that.
Sorry, I have to move my bar off my tab. I'm trying to mute and screen share at the same time. There we go. So let's look at this same page. I'm going to collapse that code view, and I'm actually going to move from this reference tab to the next tab in the sidebar on the left there, structure. So in the structure tab, as Jared mentioned, it outlines these regions, these headings that he just talked about. And it actually gives you a little bit of extra information as well. If you are using Wave and you see any icons, and there's alternative text and other prompts to help with this, but if there are ever icons that are kind of grayed out, that indicates that this icon is something that's currently hidden. A screen reader user isn't going to read this. The user navigating by a keyboard, it's not there essentially for the end user. Sometimes that means it's not going to be an accessibility issue. It's just hidden from everyone. Sometimes, though, it indicates a problem like what we see in the sidebar here. There's a header, a main, and a footer region. So these three regions that are hidden from everybody. And those are kind of the three essential regions that basically, not all, but the large majority of web pages should have, because most have stuff at the top, main content, and then headers or footer stuff at the bottom. But that's hidden from all users in this case, and there's no content in them. So that indicates a problem that you definitely want to follow up on. It does identify some other regions. There's this navigation region, and if I click on a region, it will go to that place in the main page. There's a navigation region around the main content, a region to identify the search part of the page, and a side as well. It's just kind of sidebar type of information, which is great. It also, in Wave, will show me the heading structure of this page. Now, this should be all inside main, but because of the kind of broken structure there is right now, that these headings appear after a side, not really in a region. But if we just focus right now on the heading structure, I can click this H1 icon in the sidebar, or I can find the H1 icon in the main area of the page. And these do kind of, if I click on something in the sidebar, it will highlight that in the main window. And it tells me that the first kind of main heading of this page is a heading 1, which is appropriate, right? That's what I want. I want this to be a heading 1. This is what this page is about. And so, excellent. If I continue in the structure panel on the side here, it shows me that the next heading on the page is an H5. Now, as part of my process to evaluate this, I would want to scan through this page and make sure, are there any other things that should be headings that maybe aren't identified as headings? Wave does have an alert, flags some types of things that maybe should be headings. It looks for big text and not too much of it. In this case, there isn't another block that should be a heading, so that's just fine. There is, though, at the very bottom, a heading 5, and there's an icon next to this heading 5 telling me this is a skipped heading level. It's an alert because I need to identify what's the impact of this. You know, that's what alerts mean. It means time to inspect, time to dig deeper. So, you know, that is there to help me notice that there is a jump in level, in this case, all the way from 1 to 5. But I actually would want to take a step back and ask myself, is this content really meant to be a heading? These are the tags at the bottom of the page. What does it describe? What content comes after that's described by this heading? Well, really nothing. So in this case, what Wave will help me identify is that I have content that is marked up as a heading that really shouldn't be a heading at all. It should really just be a paragraph or, you know, div or something that contains that text as opposed to a heading. So that's the kind of testing you can do of regions and headings using Wave.
See. All right. So moving on to images and alternative text. So one of the big aspects of accessibility. Now you could use a screen reader, right, to identify images, listen to the alternative text. On the other extreme, you can get into dev tools and see the actual code. Again, this is a place where Wave or other testing tools can be much more efficient in that testing process. Wave does have a wide variety of tests for images. There was, let me hit send here real quick. I'm typing answers and trying to speak at the same time. There was a question in the Q&A in reference to alt text. Does the tool just evaluate for something versus nothing, or if it's too long? And does it confirm if the alt text entry is accurate or applicable? So there is a lot, does more than just those few little tests. It gives you a lot more insight into the accessibility and potential impacts of various types of alternative text and various types of media and images. It cannot, however, in fact, no automated tool could tell you if your alternative text is appropriate, whether it's actually equivalent content for an image. No automated tool can do that. But what Wave does is it helps facilitate that human testing by identifying the images in the page and presenting the alternative text. It allows a human tester to see potential issues, to examine the image in the context of its alternative text, and then determine whether that is important, if it's equivalent for that particular image. So sometimes just a visual scan along with Wave, and then maybe dev tools, if you need to get into the code, is going to give you the level of depth needed for image testing.
Quick demonstration of that using the same Wave test. One thing worth pointing out, in the details panel here, I can hide and show icons to help simplify my view. For example, I'm not really looking at contrast right now. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So I can kind of simplify the view, and if that helps in evaluation. But if I look at wave, as Jared mentioned, there are icons that indicate images have the alt attribute of an image, right? An IMG tag. So I've got an image at the top of the page here. The icon, if I click on this wave icon, it tells me it's a linked image. So knowing that as a function might help me evaluate whether or not the alternative text is accurate. And then next to the icon in green is the alternative text, in this case, NASA. Now the case doesn't match. It's N at uppercase N, lowercase ASA, not the way NASA is normally spelled or presented. Is that a WCAG failure? Probably not. Is it worth noting? Probably, to make that more consistent. So it's a good example of how Wave can tell me this is something that, yes, it's a green icon, but you really need to look and make sure it's equivalent, as Jared just talked about. It's also a green icon telling me that this main image in this press release is a linked image that has pretty lengthy alternative text. And then there is an alert next to that icon indicating it is kind of long. Now it's an alert. It's not a red icon, right? It's not saying all long alternative text is a failure and you cannot have it. It's saying this is longer than usual. Maybe you want to look at this and see if it's appropriate. And in this case, it probably, while not a WCAG failure, going beyond the mark with things like this being maybe a little more descriptive isn't typically a failure. But this alternative text is probably a little longer than it needs to be, and it probably goes a little bit beyond what is really conveyed in the image and starts to repeat things in the caption below. So the image itself, well, first I'll read the alternative text. The image alternative text is NASA's new class of astronauts appear on stage during their graduation ceremony at the agency's Johnson Space Center in Houston. Is that more than what I see when I look at this picture? Yeah, probably. I think some of that stuff is really just repeating, as I said, the caption, and more succinct alternative text would be more equivalent. Now, the green icon tells me that this is a link. Because it's a link, it must have alternative text. But this gives me the information to help make that decision. Now, some images on this page don't have icons like that. There are these Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, these icons for social media. Now, there is a little alert next to that that tells me that there is some redundant title text. So it gives me a little bit of information, but it doesn't tell me what is the alternative text. So to drill a little deeper there, I'm actually going to actually refresh this page, not use Wave for a second. And I am going to introduce something into developer tools and dev tools. I'm going to inspect this element, and I'm going to choose, and I am going to come to a tool that's really useful. Now, this is a tool that even if you're not super comfortable in your code, can be a very useful tool. It's this inspector. And if I click in the upper left corner, or it's Control-Shift-C on Windows, I can't remember exactly on Mac, Command-Shift-C, I think. Someone can correct me in chat. But if I turn on this inspector, what I can do is I can hover over these images. And when I find this thing that has a role of IMG, that's an image, it tells me the name is Facebook. And in this case, the name is basically, it's essentially the alternative text. So this is a nice way to inspect some of those things where Wave doesn't give me that information. If I want to dig deeper, I can click on that and it'll jump into the code and I can do a little bit of digging. But that gives you an idea of how I can use one really useful tool in developer tools, this inspector, to get an idea. Now it is mouse only, but it can give me that information that Wave alone can't always provide.
Okay, next we could consider navigation and interaction, right? And we could consider like forms as part of this too, like how we interact with forms, and Wave can identify form accessibility issue, like inputs that are missing labels, and you can get into more detail with those in dev tools. Screen readers can be great for that too. But for that navigation and interaction, this is really kind of the win of those W's that we introduced. This is where accessibility testing, especially using automated automated tools can become difficult because very often the accessibility issues are not present or detectable until there is user interaction with that content. Things like dialog boxes, error messages. The Wave browser extensions can be helpful for that because you can run those extension tools at any point during that process. In other words, you could trigger a form error message and have that be present in the page and then run Wave to do that. But when you're dealing with that type of interaction, like using the keyboard and identifying keyboard accessibility issues, automated tools aren't always the best at that. Wave can identify things that it knows are going to be keyboard accessibility issues, but very often those are difficult to do in an automated way. And so that's where dev tools can sometimes be handy to get into that level of detail and code and interaction and event handlers and things like that. So kind of this is an area where you kind of need to focus on the user experience on one end and then the deep inspection with dev tools on the other side. And Wave and other tools can sometimes help a little bit in the middle. So when it comes to that keyboard testing, we recommend testing with a screen reader on and with the screen reader off, especially on Windows, because that keyboard interaction can change when a screen reader is running. Other types of interactions, though, Henny gave an excellent session earlier today on mouse users, or that was yesterday, I guess, and that will be available in the recordings. And just, you know, that type of interaction, again, because it's very dynamic and user-driven, can be a little bit difficult. But that keyboard testing really is essential, whether it's a primary way of accessing content or secondary. Our evaluation guide that we've shared in text does go into depth in those keyboard interactions. It outlines the standard keyboard shortcuts that might be used, especially for testing accessibility issues. So we'd refer you to that to get more detail.
Hey, I know we've got so much to cover, and some of this is going to be a little bit quick, but keyboard testing can be as basic as hitting the tab key. You know, if I come in, I'm going to make this page just a tiny bit larger. If I start hitting the tab key, actually, I did jump a little bit. There's a little skip link at the beginning, but if I start hitting the tab key, I can just navigate to this page. Probably want to see, well, are these menus accessible if I'm just navigating with the keyboard? If I continue to hit the tab key, now I'm in a place where there is no visual indication. Now, if I wanted to dig a little deeper into why that's occurring, and we're not going to go this deep for time and just for, you know, sake of how complex it is, but I can always inspect one of these elements. I can click using the mouse inspector, or I can right click on an element and select inspect. And if I can find, say, the link where that focus outline should be, one very useful tab, and if you're already comfortable with DevTools, and you probably use this tab, is the Styles tab, because it can allow you to see, well, what is the style that's causing these outlines to disappear? Or how do I lock in a state like a mouse hover or a keyboard focus so that I can test that a little bit more, either with Wave or developer tools or in some other way? It can allow me to kind of set those so that I can inspect at a deeper level.
Okay. All right. A couple other little odds and ends here as we get towards the end. Zooming the page or testing responsive layouts. And there is an interrelation there, right? Smaller screen sizes can trigger different responsive views. Zooming the page for somebody that has low vision can trigger those same things. There is a requirement in the web content accessibility guidelines that testing it at 1280 pixels width, and you can do that, find that browser width using DevTools, and then zooming up to 400%. Looking for things that become broken, looking for unnecessary horizontal scrolling. Be sure to test things like the mobile menu. Things that are changing and adapting in those responsive breakpoints is really important. Wave can be tested at different zoom levels, so it can detect accessibility issues that may be different in mobile views versus maybe a desktop or tablet type of view. So that can be handy as well. You can also emulate mobile devices in DevTools and then use Wave to test based on that mobile emulation within the browser. But this is an area where that kind of middleware, right? That manual testing component is going to be really important.
This is going to be a real quick demo of how that's going. I already resized this page using the sidebar to a 1280 pixel width. And now if I start hitting Control, because I'm on Windows, if I'm on Mac, it'd be Command and plus, I can start to zoom this page up to 400%. It's a little hard to see on the screen because it is quite small, but toward the far, I guess, right end of the address bar, it shows me the percent of that. So really what I want to do is check at 400 up to really 400%. Does this page break? Now there are things like scrolling that are not allowed according to WCAG because of the difficulty in evaluating the page. And there's some other issues here as well, but that's the kind of test that I would want to do. In this case, the scrolling and the covering of content, some other things, these would be failures of these requirements when it comes to zooming content.
Yeah, another aspect of testing is contrast and color. This can get really complex. We do have a detailed article on the WebAIM site that gets into testing contrast. We have a real quick example of this. If we consider this basic piece of content, we have a customized checkbox. We have adjacent text of I agree to the terms of use, and terms of use is a link, and that link is not underlined. So you might consider like how many accessibility tests are necessary for this content to determine sufficient contrast as defined by the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So you might just consider like how many individual tests are going to be necessary here. And the answer might surprise you, right? Well, you might think, well, there's like, there's at least 15, right? And we have an article that goes into the details of that, that kind of outlines those 15 distinct tests, because there can be different states of components, hover, focus states. We're dealing with custom elements. We're dealing with a link that does not have an underline. Then when you get into the contrast of images and text within images, it gets even more complex. Version 2.2 of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines will add additional new requirements for the area consumed by focus indicators and how that area contrasts with other things. And so, yes, at least 15 for that basic thing. This can get really difficult. As before, there are some really helpful tools that can facilitate this testing.
So just real briefly show what you can do in WAVE. WAVE, you can test kind of that default state, one of the 15 or, of different possible states, but the one that people are going to see at the start. I did a little shortcut. I already started WAVE or loaded this page, ran WAVE, kind of hit everything but the contrast issues. If I come to the final tab in the sidebar of contrast, it will show me what is the contrast. It does look at size because size of text can impact how much contrast is required. So it does factor that. And then DevTools has some very powerful, developer tools has some very powerful tools to test for contrast, which I did unhide, but it's not, because it's faster to do. Including a mouse inspector that gives you information and some very powerful tools built into styles. Again, that just help you dig deeper into what contrast should I have? What about these different states we talked about? How can I lock those in to test some of those colors? We do have an article just on contrast in DevTools because there is so much that can be done there. But use WAVE for the things that WAVE can identify. Look at the page visually and identify, are there other areas where I need to look at contrast? How about graphics? You will need maybe additional tools that have eyedroppers and things like that. And we do have articles that go into more detail into how you can, and it might take quite a while, but how you can evaluate all of the different contrast requirements. And that does lead us to our final point, one that is that it's probably good we don't have too long to talk about, because it's one of those you either talk about it for a minute or an hour or more. And so I'm just going to kind of quickly mention that evaluating with things that have ARIA. ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It's a way to build on or change the information in a page and change or build on what's conveyed, especially to screen reader users. But as you start getting more complex as some of the ARIA that's used, screen reader behavior can become less consistent. If you're just testing image alternative text and basic form labels and things like that, all screen readers, while they might be different, will be consistent in what's presented. If you start getting into some crazy ARIA-built widgets, you might need to start testing multiple screen readers, multiple browsers, and so there's just more testing. And it's also pretty difficult to know how should this thing behave. There are a lot of rules to ARIA, a lot of things that can go wrong. We will throw a link in just a minute into chat for the authoring practices guide, a document that outlines for many common widgets, how should they behave? What should the ARIA be? What should the keyboard interaction be for these kinds of things with examples built in? This is the accessibility reference that I use the most of these authoring practices guide. Another reason evaluating ARIA is hard is you're going to be switching between tools all the time. Often when I'm testing things that are especially heavy in ARIA, I might have even two windows that run the same page. One is kind of my discovery page, right? I might use WAVE, I might use a screen reader. I'm going to kind of figure out, well, what's going on. Then I have another window that's my inspect, dig deep, see what's broken. And we'll use dev tools quite a bit for that process. And so that's a big part of why it's difficult. And another is just how much ARIA is built into sites and ARIA overload. I've got a screenshot here. This is unfortunately not as uncommon as it should be, but there are on the screenshot of a page where there are over 1,300 ARIA issues, which is more than, there are fewer, it's more than 1,000 more ARIA issues than all other WAVE rules on this page combined. How do you evaluate that? You really need to chunk it and go piece by piece as you start to dig a little bit deeper into some of this ARIA. So just kind of keep that in mind. And just as we come back to this idea that often, you know, this is just going to be a process. It's going to be kind of a cycle. Find something, dig deeper, find something, dig deeper. Make sure to look at those 5 or 6, I guess, W's as you are doing this, just to make sure that you're thorough in what you're testing and then thorough in what you're reporting as well. And thank you, Sasha reminded me, I will throw a link. If someone at WebAIM doesn't beat me to it, I will throw a link in the chat for these authoring practices guidelines. So we're running short on time. We got a bunch of amazing questions. Jared, you've probably been looking at those a little bit more. Let you maybe field 1 or 2 of those as I find that link.
Sure. Yep, you bet. You should probably stop your share, I think, if you're done there. There were a couple of questions that came in about AI, especially in the context, AI meaning artificial intelligence, in the context of WAVE and accessibility testing for images and alternative text. Well, AI can do a pretty good analysis of an image. Well, the visual aspects of an image, right? It can very often tell you what the image is of. And that could be really helpful, right? To maybe identify if there's a significant mismatch between alternative text and what AI thinks the image is of. Or potentially if there's not alternative text, it could hint as to what the image is of. One of the real reluctances that we have about implementing that type of AI testing, especially in the context of images, is that AI is not all that good at determining content, right? It could look at an image of me and describe what I look like and maybe describe the background, but is that the actual content of an image? The context of an image is so important. And so, yes, while I think those things could be really, really helpful, and we're looking at those types of ways to integrate AI and machine learning to make accessibility testing more efficient and smarter. When it comes to content, it's so much dependent on the author's intent and some subjectivity there. And so it could be helpful, but it is not the silver bullet. It's not the solution to many of those. So yeah, really good questions there about AI. Let's see, there was another one here. Oh, there was the comment about that WAVE, sometimes with dynamic content, you can trigger dynamic content, you can interact with a page and then activate the WAVE extension to check that state of the page. But sometimes when you turn Wave back off, it does reset that page, and then you have to re-go through that process. That is something that we're looking at addressing in a future version. So you do actually run Wave multiple times on various dynamic states of a page without that page refreshing. So we do know that that is a little bit of a limitation. That is something that we're looking at fixing in a near future update.
So many good questions, so little time. Evaluation is, first you need to learn everything about accessibility and then learn everything about testing it all in an hour. We know that it was kind of drinking through from a fire hose here. Thank you so much. We'll answer a couple of these questions in chat as well, but we do appreciate your time. Jared, I guess I'll let you do any final wrap up if you want on the.
Yeah, there was a question if Wave collects information from your computer or if it only evaluates the web page. Yeah, the Wave extension is entirely private to your system, so there's no collection of anything there. But yeah, we'll maybe stick around and answer via text, chat, some of these other questions that have come in. But we want to thank you for the 2 days. We want to express appreciation to our interpreters for sticking with us and handling some fairly complex topics and acronyms that we've thrown at them.
You earned your pay in this last hour, that's for sure. I'm sure it was a tough one. Thank you.
We appreciate our friends at Pope Tech for helping us host this, 3Play Media for sponsoring our captioning, and most of all of you participants that have made this a success. We will have recordings available over the coming months and are looking forward to doing this again next year. Thank you.